The dust of the old Spanish trail was a choking red shroud, clinging to every worn piece of canvas, settling in the desperate creases of every emigrant's face. It was October 1849, and the wagon train that had departed Salt Lake City had already fractured. A common affliction of great migrations, where hope quickly curdles into impatience and suspicion. Leading the main cautious column was Captain Jefferson Hunt, a man of steadfast pace and known routes. But for the hundreds of others, the sight of the towering Sierra Nevada, already dusted with the promise of early snow, filled them with a cold dread. They were too late. The passes would soon be sealed, and the thought of wintering in the miserable, barren lands of the Great Basin was a hell worse than the trail itself. Among the discontented was Elias Thorne, a blacksmith from Illinois. Elias wasn't a man driven by glittering greed, but by a quiet, gnawing pressure, a mortgage back home, and the sickly cough of his young son, Charlie. California, he had told his wife, was the cure. Gold was merely the vessel. Elias leaned against the flank of his lead ox, whose ribs were starting to show like the timbers of a wrecked ship. He watched a small, nervous man named Reverend Breyer gesticulate wildly at the edge of the camp, holding up a greasy, hand-drawn map. 500 miles saved! Breyer's voice was a frantic screech against the canyon walls. A straight line, friends, a route marked by the Lord himself, cutting directly west through the mountains. No need to swing south for months on Hunt's tiresome trail. Elias spat dust. Hunt's tiresome trail works, Reverend. That map is drawn on a prayer and a half bottle of whiskey. A voice cut in, sharp and eager. Asahel Bennett, a farmer with a wife and 3 young children, stepped forward. But what if it's true, Elias? What if it saves us a month? A month means we beat the winter. A month means we're panning gold while Hunt's train is still crawling through the Mojave. It was the oldest temptation in the American West, the shortcut, the promise of effortless gain, the belief that one man's certainty could override 1,000 years of geographical reality. The specter of the Donner Party, the tragedy of '46, where a similar shortcut had sealed their fate in the Sierra snows, was a fresh wound on the collective memory of the nation. Yet the lust for California made men believe that fate would choose another victim this time. Elias looked at the faces around him, the desperate young bachelors known as the Jayhawkers, full of youthful arrogance, the weary, stoic Wade family, moving silently in the rear, and the vulnerable Bennett Arcane families with their children. They were a microcosm of the gold rush, bound by a shared, foolish hope. On November 4th, 1849, near a place they called Little Salt Lake, the Great Schism occurred. Captain Hunt continued south, his face grim. The majority of the train, over 100 wagons and hundreds of souls, turned west, following the siren call of the fraudulent map. Elias, watching the dust rise from the splinter group, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. His wife, Sarah, put a hand on his arm, her eyes pleading. "It's the quickest path to safety, Elias," she whispered, echoing Bennett's doomed rationale. "The quickest path to California." He nodded, not because he believed it, but because the collective momentum of the foolish shortcut was now stronger than any individual wisdom. He lashed his oxen, turning the wagon west, following the map that promised salvation and delivered damnation. The first few weeks were not terrible, but they were a lie. They managed to traverse a few canyons and plains, the false hope buoying their spirits. But soon the mountains they needed to cross became a hostile, impenetrable fortress of jagged peaks, and the fertile canyons of the map gave way to desiccated salt beds and the relentless, thirsty expanse of the Mojave Desert. They had left the known world. The water holes began to run dry, marked only by the bleached skeletons of animals that had sought them before. The wagons began to break, their wheels warping and splintering in the heat. Elias, the blacksmith, was constantly repairing axles and hammering tires back onto rims, his calloused hands growing blistered from the futile effort. By Christmas Eve, the groups had fragmented entirely. The Jayhawkers, recognizing that their wagons were now millstones around their necks, had made the hard decision. They slaughtered their oxen, dried the meat, and burned their wagons, a terrifying final commitment to the shortcut, now turned into a grueling, foot-slogging escape. They disappeared north into the mountains, driven by a desperate, frantic energy. The Bennett and Arcane families with their small children could not manage that sacrifice. They limped into a deep, desolate valley, surrounded by the towering, snow-capped Panamint Range to the west and the forbidding Amargosa Range to the east.
Elias Thorne, his family attached to the Bennett Arcane party, looked out over the vista on Christmas morning. The air was a suffocating, arid oven, yet the mountains above held snow. Below, the valley floor was a blinding white expanse of salt, shimmering like a lake that was not water, but pure mockery. They had been seeking a shortcut to the gold fields. They had instead discovered a natural coffin. The animals were dying. The last of the flour was gone. The only sound was the wind, a dry, rasping whisper that seemed to carry no hope, only the mocking echo of their own foolish choice. "We cannot go on," Asahel Bennett declared, his voice broken, his eyes sunk deep into their sockets. "We have reached the end of the line." Elias looked at Sarah, holding Charlie, the boy weak and silent. They were trapped at the bottom of a bowl, 1,000 feet below sea level, where every breath felt like inhaling fire. It was a lone voice, belonging to one of the women, perhaps Martha Bennett or Abigail Arcane, who looked back at the blinding expanse of the valley floor, the place of their slow, agonizing death. As she was led away from the camp, she turned and let out a strangled, defiant sob that the wind carried away. Goodbye, Death Valley. The name, a declaration, a curse, a promise, had been given. The great shortcut of 49 had been paid for in full, and the price was a place on the map that would forever be synonymous with the failure of human ambition against the indifference of nature. The true struggle for survival and the beginning of the whispers in the sand was only just beginning. 20 years had passed since the tragic folly that branded the valley with its ominous name. The bleached bones of oxen and the skeletal remains of wagons were no longer fresh monuments to failure. They were simply parts of the landscape, like the dry washes and the salt-caked flats. Yet where one generation found a graveyard, the next saw only opportunity. The scar of Death Valley was, to the new breed of prospector, merely a signpost pointing toward untold mineral riches. The 1870s was a decade of frenzied extraction across the American West. The Comstock lode had proven that unimaginable wealth lay beneath the desert floor, and the geologic logic that, where there was volcanic fury, there was often mineral treasure, held a potent allure. No place was more furious or more forbidding than Death Valley. Our story's central figure, Silas Vance, arrived in 1873, not seeking gold, but silver. Gold was a madness for the masses. Silver was the backbone of empire, the currency of the future. Silas was not a desperate fool of the 49er mold. He was a calculated risk-taker, lean and sharp-eyed, carrying a surveyor's transit and a geologic hammer rather than a pickaxe. He possessed the steely, cold-eyed confidence that came from surviving the Civil War and realizing that the only reliable currency was one's own grit. Silas had spent the last 5 years combing the unforgiving slopes of the Panamints, working on the fringes of the Darwin and Coso districts. He had learned the desert's terrible rhythm, The furnace-like days, the diamond-cold nights, the deceitful shimmer of the mirage. He had also learned to trust a geological hunch over any map drawn by a greenhorn. His hunch, fueled by a faint mineral streak he'd tracked from the Argus Range, led him directly toward the heart of the valley, near the Funeral Mountains, a name he found grimly poetic. A land that kills its own name is a land that hides its deepest secrets, he often muttered to his sole companion, a grumpy, patient burro he'd named Ethelred, after a hapless Saxon king. One brutal afternoon in August, Silas stood atop a ridge overlooking the vast expanse of the valley floor. He wasn't looking at the salt flats, he was looking at the jagged, heavily stained rock formations beneath his feet. He broke off a chunk of dark, heavy ore with his hammer. A careful scrape with his knife revealed a crystalline flash beneath the dull patina. It was hornsilver, or carrargerite, not a scatter of flakes, but a solid vein, dense and promising, running through the quartz matrix like threads of destiny. The concentration was staggeringly high. Silas felt the thrill, not the manic fever of a prospector, but the cool, proprietary satisfaction of a businessman who had just secured a monopoly. The vein, if it held, was enough to start a mine, to build a camp, and to challenge the supremacy of Nevada's great operations. "Well, Ethelred," Silas murmured, wiping sweat from his brow, "looks like we've stumbled on to the Lord's treasury, right in his devil's domain." He established his claim quietly, meticulously, driving stakes that would hold up in any court of law. He named the claim the Pharos Lode, thinking of the great lighthouse of Alexandria, a city of knowledge and wealth that stood defiant against chaos, a clear sign that Silas saw himself as bringing light and order to this savage place. However, the sheer difficulty of the task quickly asserted itself. A single rich vein was a claim, but turning it into a fortune required infrastructure, water, transportation, and manpower. The nearest reliable water was miles away, demanding a pipe be laid across blistering terrain. The ore had to be hauled out across 160 miles of some of the hardest ground on Earth. Unlike the coastal areas where rivers offered transport, here every pound of ore, every barrel of water, every stick of timber had to be moved by mule team, or later the massive, slow-moving 20-mule teams that characterized the valley's borax operations. Silas realized he couldn't do this alone. He needed capital, and he needed a partner who possessed a blend of pragmatism and ambition equal to his own. He rode out of the valley, leaving Ethelred and a cache of supplies hidden in a dry cave, his mind already calculating tonnage, smelter costs, and shareholder percentages. He carried with him the heavy, dark promise of the ore sample. In the bustling chaos of San Francisco, Silas found his required counterpoint, Eleanor Reese. She was the unexpected face of capital, not a staid banker, but the savvy, sharp-witted inheritor of a shipping fortune. Eleanor had a reputation for funding high-risk, high-reward ventures that older, more conservative financiers wouldn't touch. She sought not just profit, but legacy, a way to carve her own name onto the map of the booming West. When Silas laid the blackened sample of hornsilver on her mahogany desk, Eleanor didn't immediately reach for a magnifying glass or a chemical assay. She leaned back, surveying Silas with an unnerving, calculating stillness. "Death Valley," she stated, her voice cool and measured. "It's a cemetery, Mr. Vance." "It's a storage vault, Ms. Reese," I corrected, his gaze unwavering. "The men who died there in '49 were looking for a shortcut. They were fools driven by panic, not geology. The valley is brutal, but it is predictable, and its violence has protected this wealth for us. No casual prospector will survive long enough to find the Pharos Lode." He detailed the logistics, the proposed pipeline, the staging of the mule teams, the necessity of building a smelter on site to reduce the bulk of the ore before the long haul. He didn't romanticize the risk, he quantified it. Eleanor slowly picked up the ore sample. The glint of silver caught the afternoon sun slanting through her office window. She saw not the hardship, she saw the future. A mountain of coinage, a railroad spur, her name on a mine shaft. She saw control. "I will fund the initial capital, Mr. Vance," she finally said, placing the heavy ore back down. "But on one condition. I will not be a silent partner. My engineer, my accountant, and my word will be absolute. You may be the finder, but I will be the architect of the operation." Silas Vance, driven by the desire for security and independence, and Eleanor Reese, fueled by the ambition for indelible legacy, shook hands on the deal. They were a pairing forged in the ruthless logic of the era, the pragmatic prospector and the calculating capitalist. They would confront Death Valley not as desperate victims, but as an organized industrial force. But even the most meticulous calculation could not account for the valley's peculiar brand of madness, a madness that whispered not only in the dry wind, but in the sand itself. They were coming to a place named for death, and they would soon discover that the echoes of the past were more than just the memory of the 49ers. The whispers of the dunes were waiting for them. The valley was not merely hot, it was a physical embodiment of heat, a crucible where the sun's rays were trapped by the sheer unyielding walls of the surrounding mountains. To Silas Vance and the crew he marshaled for the Pharos Lode operation, Death Valley was a forge that tested the integrity of their every material and every intention.
The air itself was a weapon. It was so arid that the moisture was instantly drawn from skin, wood, and leather. Men working the shafts felt their lips crack within an hour, and the wooden handles of their tools would shrink, threatening to slip from the metal heads. Silas kept the men working in staggered shifts, forcing them to rest during the most punishing midday hours, knowing that the desert's most effective killer was not thirst, but complacency. Below the funeral range, stretching away from the dusty skirts of their claim, lay the valley's true heart of darkness, the Great Salt Pan. This was no smooth, sandy desert. This was the Devil's Golf Course, a vast, blinding expanse of crystallized halite, sculpted by centuries of evaporation into an alien topography. It was a sea of impossibly sharp, pyramidal salt formations, some reaching several feet high. Travel across it was impossible. The salt shattered like glass, the shards tearing through boots, tires, and hoofs alike. It was a landscape engineered by elemental malice, impassable and beautiful in its lethal precision. Eleanor Reese's chief engineer, a pragmatic German named Herr Schmidt, surveyed the salt flats with a look of defeated awe. "Mr. Vance, your claim is rich," Schmidt reported, adjusting his spectacles against the glare. "But that is a curse. We must haul 200 tons of supplies in, and then 1,000 tons of ore out. The shortest route is across the ford, but it is impossible. We must route the wagon road around the entire perimeter, adding 50 miles to the journey." Silas knew the expense. 50 extra miles meant exponentially more water, more time, and more wages. It meant their silver, already deeply buried, was now 50 miles farther from the mint. "We will do it, Schmidt," Silas replied, pointing toward a specific dark mass far to the south. "We will use the southern route, where the salt is shallower and more packed. But tell your team this: every single item of equipment, every mule shoe, every boiler part, every barrel of whiskey must be accounted for. The valley does not tolerate carelessness. It claims everything lost, and it never returns it." The heat was not the only psychological pressure. The very stillness of the valley was unnerving. When the wind was silent, the air felt thick, heavy with an unnatural quiet. It was in these moments that the men began to feel like the only living things in a world of silent, ancient observers. The only sounds were the dreadful thwump, thwump, thwump of the 20-mule team borax wagons moving slowly on the horizon, or the constant, dull rattle of the dry air as it moved over the mica schist of the slopes. Yet sometimes, usually just before dusk, when the shadows stretched long and thin, the miners on the Pharaoh's claim would hear something else. It began as a low, almost subsonic vibration, felt more in the chest than heard with the ear. Then it would build, a sustained humming resonance, a deep musical chord that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, specifically from the great sand dunes that lay in a separate bowl of the valley, miles away from their silver claim. "The sand sings, boss," a young Irish mule driver named Paddy had told Silas, his face pale beneath the grime. "It sings for the souls of the 49ers, the ones who starved. It's the sound of the thirsty earth waiting for the next fool to fail." Silas, the pragmatist, had investigated. He rode to the edge of the nearest dune field and climbed the slope. The sound was undeniably present, a loud, clear, low-frequency hum, the very air vibrating around him. He attributed it to the friction of the wind moving over the unique spherical shape of the quartz sand grains, setting up a colossal, natural acoustic phenomenon. He rationalized it. But even Silas, the cool head of the operation, could not deny the primal, chilling quality of the sound. It was not a happy sound. It was the sound of geologic time, an ancient bass groan that seemed to confirm the valley's hostility. It felt less like a natural occurrence and more like a mythical antagonist stretching its muscles. The funeral range watched, the devil's golf course mocked, and the dunes sang their terrifying, deep-bellied song. Silas Vance had brought his industry, his maps, and his modern logic to the valley, but the valley met him with silence, heat, and a voice that belonged to a history older than any human greed. The scar of the past was about to reopen, and the singing dunes were the first warning. In a valley named for death, Furnace Creek was a defiant, improbable pocket of life. Fed by perennial springs that bled from the ground near the base of the Amargosa Range, it was a miniature ecosystem of date palms, thick reeds, and cooling shadows. A true Timbisha, rock paint, oasis in the Timbisha Shoshone language, marking a point of reliable, ancient passage. For Silas Vance and his crew, Furnace Creek was a lifeline. It was the only place where the relentless, desiccating pressure of the valley momentarily eased, offering sweet, cold water and a chance to rest the animals and repair the souls of the men. It served as the central staging point for the Pharaoh's Load operation, a crucial stop along the long, laborious haul route.
The atmosphere at the creek, however, was thick with tension, a meeting point between two worlds that had little understanding and less patience for each other. The Shoshone people, who had endured in this valley for centuries, called themselves the Numu, the people. They regarded the sudden invasion of bearded, sweating men and their noisy machinery with a mixture of resigned tolerance and quiet contempt. They understood the valley not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a severe, demanding relative to be respected. They had names for every water source, every peak, every treacherous dry wash, knowledge gleaned over millennia. The center of this uneasy contact was a small, dusty adobe structure built by an earlier settler, which now functioned as a makeshift depot and way station. Silas often spent nights here, watching the embers of his fire, listening for the telltale sounds of the desert that his untrained ears couldn't quite decipher. It was here he met Wea, a Timbisha woman whose age was indeterminate. Her face was etched with the lines of hard sun and deep knowledge. She was one of the few who spoke enough English to act as an occasional, reluctant intermediary between the miners and her people. Silas, ever the pragmatist, saw her knowledge as a tool. He approached her one evening after a brutal week of dynamiting the Pharaoh's claim. "Wea," Silas began, offering her a twist of good tobacco. "My men are sick. They say the water from the upper spring is curdled. We need to know which pools are safe, which ones the Numu use." Wea took the tobacco but did not meet his eyes, instead looking out toward the looming shadow of the funeral range. "You ask the land for its bones and its blood, Tibi Noon," she said, her voice low and even. "The land takes care of its own. It does not like being dug." Silas sighed, frustrated by what he saw as cryptic superstition. "We aren't digging up old spirits. We're extracting silver. We pay for the water we use, and we pay for the salt we use on the roads. Tell me about the water." Wea finally turned, her dark eyes piercing his. "The safe water is known. The land tells us what the sound it makes." She paused, then tilted her head slightly. "You hear the sand, don't you? The deep sound?" Silas stiffened. He hadn't expected the whispers to be common knowledge. "The booming? Yes, geologists say it's the shape of the quartz, the wind velocity. Science, not spirits." Wea smiled, a faint, almost pitying gesture. "The desert has many truths. Your truth is flat and dry. Our truth is deep. The Numu do not go to the mountains of the singing sand. That sound, it is the morning." "The morning?" "The morning is for the lost ones," she explained, her gaze darkening. "The lost ones who come full of fire and leave only bone. The desert drinks the moisture of the body, and the sound is the land giving back the song of their last breath. When the sound is very loud, the land is very thirsty. That is when the water goes bad." Her words hit Silas with an unexpected force. They were superstition, yes, but they were tied to a verifiable fact. The times the booming dunes were loudest coincided with the valley's driest, most punishing heat cycles. The volume of the singing was, in her cultural context, a barometer of the valley's hostility. If the land was mourning, it was starving. Silas, unwilling to dismiss any piece of information that could save a mule or a man, finally conceded. "Show me the safe water, Wea. I will pay you in silver, not just tobacco." Wea stood up, pulling her shawl tighter. "The knowledge of survival is not for sale, Tibi Noon. It is a gift given by the land. But I will show you, because the children of my people still live here, and your digging, it makes the morning loud." She led him away from the main springs the miners were depleting, toward a hidden seep in the alluvial fan. The water here was cool, clear, and steady. It was a secret born of generations of patient observation, not the destructive logic of the geological survey. In that small shaded hollow at Furnace Creek, Silas Vance absorbed a crucial, uncomfortable truth. His industrial ambition and Eleanor Reese's capital were powerful, but they were alien. They were foreign bodies forced onto the valley. The Timbisha, living lightly on the land, possessed the real map of survival. He realized that the true danger of the valley was not the heat he could measure nor the distance he could plot, but the unseen forces that regulated life and death, forces the Shoshone understood intimately and which manifested in the uncanny, chilling hum of the singing sand. The oasis had given him temporary reprieve, but it had also given him a profound new tension, the tension between science and survival, between exploitation and respect. He was committed to digging out the silver, but now he knew that every ton of ore he removed would only intensify the mourning of the land. The logistics of extracting silver from the Pharos lode required constant surveying and adjustment. The proposed haul route, skirting the impassable Devil's Golf Course, needed to be mapped inch by astonishing inch to ensure the immense 20-mule teams, leased from the nascent borax operations, wouldn't sink into hidden mud sinks or shatter their axles on the hard rock salt beds. This tedious, punishing task fell to Herr Schmidt, Eleanor Reese's pragmatic German engineer, the man of pure measurement and calculation. Schmidt was utterly immune to the valley's melodrama, treating its 120-degree heat and crushing aridity as mere variables in his equations. On a late afternoon in September, Schmidt was alone, hammering wooden stakes into the ground near the lowest point of the valley, a vast, flat expanse where the salt pan gave way to fine, reddish-yellow alluvial sand. He was several miles from Furnace Creek, pushing the line a bit farther than was strictly advisable before the sun dipped behind the Panamints. The heat had begun to break, replaced not by cold, but by a sudden, unnerving stillness. The wind, their constant companion and irritant, vanished entirely. The air became so quiet that Schmidt could hear the rapid thump, thump of his own heart. He knelt to check his transit. As he aligned the leveling bubble, he felt it, a vibration that began not in his ears, but beneath his knees, traveling up through the hard-packed earth. It was a low hum, a sound of immense sustained frequency. It wasn't the high-pitched whistle of wind over rocks, nor the distant clatter of a mule wagon. This sound was fundamental, a deep B-flat that seemed to defy the silence. Schmidt, a man who trusted his instruments over his senses, checked his internal pocket watch, expecting to find the distant rhythmic throb of a steam pump. But the watch was silent. He looked around. Nothing moved. The funeral mountains, now cast in purple shadow, stood like silent, towering judges. The humming began to grow, slowly escalating in volume, taking on a new texture, a powerful, resonant roar, like 1,000 cello bows being drawn across a colossal, subterranean string. It emanated directly from the towering sand dunes several miles north, a majestic, pristine field of crescent-shaped giants, known to the Shoshone as the Mountains That Walk. Schmidt felt a cold, metallic prickle of fear pierce his analytical composure. The sound was so loud now that the ground under his boots seemed to vibrate rhythmically. He felt it in his teeth, a profound resonance that made his chest cavity ache. He ran toward the dunes, driven by a scientific curiosity that momentarily overcame his instinct for self-preservation. As he got closer, the sound intensified, transforming from a musical tone into a complex, layered sonic event. It was a combination of roaring, buzzing, and a profound, deep sigh. He scrambled up the nearest, steepest face of a dune. The sand was utterly dry, slipping beneath his feet like liquid. When he reached the crest, he froze. The air was still. The sand was not moving, yet the noise was deafening. He realized the sound was not caused by wind pushing grains. It was caused by the mass of the sand itself, settling and sliding internally. The friction of billions of incredibly dry, precisely spherical quartz grains rubbing against each other, amplified by the natural bowl of the valley, was turning the entire dune into a monstrous geological speaker.
As he watched, a small slip of sand occurred 20 feet above him, triggered perhaps by the minute change in temperature. The cascading grains, no more than a few liters, instantly produced a shrieking metallic cry that cut through the bass hum. It was the sound of millions of tiny dry spheres screaming in unison. Schmidt, the man of logic, found his mind reeling. The Shoshone's term, the morning, suddenly felt less like superstition and more like a visceral truth. This was not a sound of life or of the present. It was the voice of the earth's endless, grinding indifference, a monumental lament for every drop of moisture stolen and every life lost. It carried the weight of the 49ers' desperate last breaths. He quickly pulled out his notebook and began furiously scribbling, trying to translate the fear into physics. Low-frequency resonance, grain diameter optimal for friction, humidity 0. But As the sun finally dipped and the light turned the sands from red to a terrifying deep violet, the humming intensified one last time, reaching a crescendo that made the hair on his arms stand up. It felt like the valley was shouting him out. He fled the dunes, leaving his surveyor's stake hammered deep into the vibrating ground. When he finally stumbled back to the camp at Furnace Creek, Silas found him pale and shaking, covered head to toe in red dust. "Schmidt, what in the name of God happened to you?" Silas demanded, gripping the engineer's shoulder. Schmidt took a deep, shuddering breath, the image of the screaming sand still vivid in his mind. He was no longer the skeptical analyst. He was a man touched by the valley's profound strangeness. "Mr. Vance," Schmidt stammered, his German accent thicker with shock. "The sand, it is alive. It does not just move, it speaks. It is not science, not entirely. It is a presence. It is a perfect mechanism of sound, a sound of colossal pressure, warning us away." He looked at Silas, the cold silver prospector. "We are digging into the earth that sings the death song of the first fools. That sound, it will not let us rest, Mr. Vance. It will drive the men mad, or it will swallow them whole." The pragmatic engineer's encounter transformed the humming from a geological curiosity into the core mystery and psychological antagonist of the Pharos lode operation. The promise of silver was now tethered directly to the terror of that inescapable echoing sound. The silver of the Pharos lode was not the only wealth being ripped from the scarred heart of Death Valley. Just miles from Silas Vance's claim, another, less glamorous, but more dependable industry was taking root: borax. Unlike the volatile, ephemeral nature of silver strikes, borax, used in soaps, glass, and industrial processes, represented steady, brutal commerce. The logistics of the borax trade provided Silas with a blueprint and a cautionary tale for his own operation. The symbol of this industrial tenacity was the 20-mule team. They were a colossal, agonizingly slow force of nature. 18 mules and 2 horses hitched to 2 massive wagons, often followed by a 1,200-gallon water wagon hauling nearly 40 tons of crystallized mineral. The entire rig stretched over 100 feet long. This was the only way to conquer the 160 miles of searing, trackless waste between the valley floor and the nearest railroad station. Silas Vance, supported by Eleanor Reese's capital, adapted this system for the silver. Their teams, though slightly smaller, faced the same brutal truth. Every pound of ore extracted meant an hour of grueling, heat-choked travel. The drivers were the kings and martyrs of this new era. These were men hardened not by desperation, but by endurance. The wagon boss walked ahead, guiding the lead horses, and the swamper rode the high seat, acting as the team's eyes and whip. One such driver, a laconic Texan named Gus Rigger Riley, became Silas's most reliable hauler. Gus wasn't concerned with the singing sand or the ghosts of the 49ers. His mind was occupied only by the tension in the trace chains, the condition of the mule's hooves, and the precious supply of water. "It ain't the heat that kills you, Mr. Vance," Gus told Silas one morning as they loaded the first heavy consignment of silver ore, the metal glinting darkly in the sun. "It's the pull. Every single animal, every single man is pulling against the whole damned valley. It's a contest of will against sand and gravity." The days of the haul were a rhythmic, monotonous torture. The dawn. The team started before the sun fully cleared the Funeral Mountains, taking advantage of the brief, cool respite. The air was often still, making the rhythmic clank of the chains and the creak of the wagon axles the only sounds. The midday crucible. By 10 a.m., the ground became a skillet. The wagon wood steamed, the iron tires were too hot to touch, and the only shade was the thin, shifting strip underneath the wagon beds. Mules, more resilient than horses, would simply stop and brace themselves against the heat, requiring the swamper to coax and curse them into motion. The dust. The procession churned up a relentless, fine dust,
often a choking cloud of borax, salt, and pulverized rock. It coated everything: lungs, eyelids, food, and water. It was this constant, abrasive reality that scarred the land and the men who moved across it. The human struggle was compounded by the psychological warfare the valley waged, a warfare amplified by the knowledge that the Singing Dunes lay directly along the southern perimeter of their route. After Herr Schmidt's uneasy encounter, the low hum became a factor in Gus Riley's calculations. When the sound was loudest, a booming, resonant moan that meant the air was bone dry and the valley was at its most volatile, the men grew anxious. The sound seemed to travel along the salt flats with unnatural clarity, entering the teamsters' minds and robbing them of the mental rest necessary for survival. Paddy, the young mule driver Silas had spoken to, began to falter. He insisted that the hum was accompanied by thin, whistling cries, the forgotten voices of those who had died thirsty, their whispers caught and amplified by the sand. "They're calling the water back, Gus," Paddy pleaded one night, his eyes wide and feverish. "They're trying to pull us down into the salt." Gus, whose hands were permanently clawed around the reins, had little patience for spirits, but he understood fear. Fear led to mistakes, and a mistake out here meant a broken wagon, a panicked team, or worst of all, a theft of the precious water supply. "That ain't ghosts, boy," Gus grunted, pointing his jaw toward the dunes. "That's the earth rubbing its damned ribs together. It's telling you to pay attention to your harness, not your damn hallucinations. The only thing that kills men out here is their own tired judgment." But the judgment of the men wasn't the only thing failing. The animals paid the highest price. Every mile was marked by the bones of mules that had finally given out, their dry, bleached skulls littering the route like discarded markers. The animals were the currency of the operation, and their loss was a quantifiable blow to Eleanor Reese's balance sheet. "Borax and bones" became the valley's unofficial motto, a grim recognition that every fortune was built upon the sacrifice of muscle and life. Silas, moving between the Pharos Lode and Furnace Creek, understood the inherent tension. The capitalist engine demanded speed and efficiency, but the valley enforced a rigid, deadly patience. He realized the Numu were right. The land was fighting back, and the 20-mule teams were merely the front line of the invasion.
The sheer scale of the operation, the tons of ore, the miles covered, the endless heat created a vulnerability. The more organized the operation, the more catastrophic the failure. Silas was constantly battling sabotage, exhaustion, and the insidious psychological toll of the morning sound. He knew that the sound wasn't just a physical phenomenon, it was the voice of the land's relentless, unbending will, and it was slowly, inevitably, driving a wedge between his men and their sanity. The struggle was no longer just about silver. It was about whether human enterprise, no matter how well-funded or meticulously planned, could permanently subdue a place so perfectly designed to destroy life. The haul continued, ton after agonizing ton, each wagon load of silver being pulled by the desperate strength of animals and men whose resolve was slowly being eroded by the haunting, deep hum of the singing sand. The sheer mechanical difficulty of the silver haul was beginning to wear down the morale of the Pharos load crew. Herr Schmidt, the chief engineer, observed the signs of stress: short tempers, exhaustion, and the growing superstition fueled by the rhythmic, unnerving morning sound emanating from the dunes. He realized the problem was not merely logistical, it was psychological. He needed an antidote to the men's escalating fear, something to remind them that the valley's strangeness, while formidable, was still bound by the laws of physics. He needed a scientific distraction. Schmidt proposed a week-long survey expedition to Silas Vance, aiming for a remote, high-altitude, dry lake bed known only to a few prospectors and the Timbisha, the racetrack playa.
"The men are breaking, Silas," Schmidt explained, consulting his maps. "They believe the land is cursed. We need to prove that its oddities, however dramatic, are natural. I've heard tales of this high plateau lake, a place where stones, some of them weighing hundreds of pounds, slide across the clay, leaving long tracks. It defies all common sense." Silas was skeptical of any venture that didn't directly involve silver extraction, agreed. The men were dangerously close to mutiny. "Take enough supplies, Schmidt," he warned, "and remember what Weah said. The desert demands respect. Do not let your curiosity make you another fool of this valley." Schmidt and a small crew set out, leaving the heat and grime of the silver claim for the strange, desolate beauty of the West.
The sheer scale of the operation, the tons of ore, the miles covered, the endless heat, created a vulnerability. The more organized the operation, the more catastrophic the failure. Silas was constantly battling sabotage, exhaustion, and the insidious psychological toll of the morning sound. He knew that the sound wasn't just a physical phenomenon, it was the voice of the land's relentless, unbending will, and it was slowly, inevitably, driving a wedge between his men and their sanity. The struggle was no longer just about silver. It was about whether human enterprise, no matter how well-funded or meticulously planned, could permanently subdue a place so perfectly designed to destroy life. The haul continued, ton after agonizing ton, each wagon load of silver being pulled by the desperate strength of animals and men whose resolve was slowly being eroded by the haunting, deep hymn of the singing sand. The sheer mechanical difficulty of the silver haul was beginning to wear down the morale of the Pharos load crew. Herr Schmidt, the chief engineer, observed the signs of stress, short tempers, exhaustion, and the growing superstition fueled by the rhythmic, unnerving morning sound emanating from the dunes. He realized the problem was not merely logistical, it was psychological. He needed an antidote to the men's escalating fear, something to remind them that the valley's strangeness, while formidable, was still bound by the laws of physics. He needed a scientific distraction. Schmidt proposed a week-long survey expedition to Silas Vance, aiming for a remote, high-altitude dry lakebed known only to a few prospectors and the Timbisha, the racetrack playa. "The men are breaking, Silas," Schmidt explained, consulting his maps. "They believe the land is cursed. We need to prove that its oddities, however dramatic, are natural. I've heard tales of this high plateau lake, a place where stones, some of them weighing hundreds of pounds, slide across the clay, leaving long tracks. It defies all common sense." Silas, though skeptical of any venture that didn't directly involve silver extraction, agreed. The men were dangerously close to mutiny. "Take enough supplies, Schmidt," he warned, "and remember what Weah said. The desert demands respect. Do not let your curiosity make you another fool of this valley." Schmidt and a small crew set out, leaving the heat and grime of the silver claim for the strange, desolate beauty of the western mountains. When they finally crested the pass and dropped into the shallow, 4,000-foot-high dry lakebed, the sight of the racetrack playa, or simply the racetrack, stole their breath. It was a perfectly flat, expansive clay pan, stark and beautiful, flanked by the steep slope of the grandstand. The floor was covered in a mosaic of cracked mud, baking under the sun. But it was the stones that commanded their attention. Scattered across the vast, empty expanse were hundreds of dark dolomite rocks, resting at the ends of long, indelible trails carved into the clay. Some trails were straight, running over 100 yards. Others were dramatic, graceful arcs, appearing as if the heavy stones had been dragged by invisible hands. There was no sign of human or animal interference, no tracks crossing the trails, only the smooth, deep grooves ending where the stones now rested. "It is magnificent," Schmidt whispered, pulling out his camera and his measuring tape, the thrill of pure scientific inquiry washing away the grime of the mine. "It is a geological impossibility.
The physics of friction at this altitude and weight. It shouldn't happen. They spent days documenting the phenomenon, sketching the trails and weighing the stones. Schmidt hypothesized about the role of ice sheeting in high winds, struggling to find a rational explanation for the rock's motion. One evening, as the sun set and painted the mountains in hues of gold and purple, the crew was huddled around a fire, discussing the strangeness of the moving rocks. It was then, miles away from the main dune field, that the sound returned. It began subtly, not the bass roar of the main dunes, but a thin, high, resonant whine, a sound of vibrating tension that seemed to be traveling through the air rather than the ground. It was like a colossal, invisible taut wire stretched across the playa. Schmidt's scientific analysis instantly linked the sounds. The sand, the stones, the salt pan, it's all connected, he exclaimed, his voice tight with excitement. The entire valley is a vast natural resonator. The air pressure, the extreme temperature difference between the day and the night, it creates a phenomenon of harmonic resonance across the low ground. He realized the racetrack playa offered a crucial piece of evidence. The force that moved the stones, likely a rare combination of flash flooding, thin ice, and powerful wind gusts, was the same elemental force that produced the sound. The stones were a physical manifestation of the valley's power. The singing was its acoustic manifestation. But as he continued to theorize, one of the younger team members, a superstitious boy named Danny, grew terrified. "It's the stones, Herr Schmidt," Danny stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the nearest trail. "The sound is moving the stones. It's the echo of the Earth's heart. When the sound is strongest, it pulls the mountains closer and spits the rocks out across the flat." He tried to reassure him, explaining wind velocity and coefficient of friction, but the sight of the massive, silent stones resting at the ends of their inexplicable journeys, coupled with the unnerving high-frequency whine cutting through the still night air, shattered the comfort of his logic. The Shoshone woman, Waya, had described the hum as the mording. Schmidt's current observations suggested that the sound and the moving stones were both the result of extreme, chaotic natural events. He connected the phenomena. 1. The dune's bass hum, the dense compression of sand particles triggered by wind or slippage. 2. The playa's high whine, the tension of super dry air moving over the smooth, vast clay, or perhaps the scraping sound of the stone's motion amplified by the perfect ceramic-like surface of the playa. The racetrack playa was a place where the forces of nature were so amplified that they became visible and audible in baffling, profound ways. As Schmidt packed his instruments, satisfied he had gathered enough data to potentially rationalize the singing sand to Silas Vance, he paused by a particularly heavy, dark stone. He noticed the trail it left was not smooth, but slightly jagged, as if the force pulling it had been erratic, struggling. He reached out and touched the stone. It was ice cold, despite the warm night air. In that moment, the scientific explanation felt thin, brittle. The truth, staring him in the face, was that the valley was a theater of forces so powerful, so immense, that they appeared supernatural to the human mind. The singing sands, the moving stones, they were manifestations of the same colossal, indifferent energy.
Schmidt left the racetrack with his data, but also with a new, profound respect for the valley's antagonistic power. He now understood that the true challenge to the Pharaoh Slode was not just hauling the ore, but surviving the land's constant, bewildering attempts to drive the invaders out with its strange, beautiful, and utterly terrifying geological mysteries. He had found the physics behind the morning, but he had lost his ability to dismiss its frightening power. The mirage of the lost mine. The confrontation with crazy Jack Pendleton had done more than just delay Silas Vance's supply run. It had planted a seed of doubt, a corrosive mix of fear and greed, in the fertile soil of his ambitious mind. Jack's final, manic instruction to seek the lost Brayfogle mine in the shimmering distance was pure delusion, yet it echoed the foundational desire that had brought Silas to the valley, the irrational pursuit of mythic, instant wealth. Silas dismissed the notion, of course. His silver was real, quantified, and secured by the Pharaoh's load. But the relentless pressure of the operation, the heat, the constant logistical nightmares, and the pervasive fear among his men demanded a reprieve, a sign that their suffering was justified. He decided to take a reconnaissance ride into the remote region near the Cottonwood Mountains, ostensibly to check for a better, cooler haul route. In truth, the ghost of the lost Breyfogle, a legendary gold strike that had tormented prospectors for decades, tugged at his spurs. A quick, successful find would solidify his legend, silencing any investor skepticism, even Eleanor Rice's. He set out alone, taking only his burro, Athelred, and minimal supplies, a dangerous confidence born of his years of desert survival. By the second day, the valley began its assault. He pushed deep into a maze of desolate canyons, the temperature hovering near 125 degrees F. A fierce, unexpected wind picked up, scouring the mountainsides and turning the air into a brown vortex of stinging sand. He missed a crucial landmark, a notch in the ridgeline, and suddenly, horrifyingly, the familiar grid of his surveyor's mind collapsed. He was not just lost, he was blinded and disoriented in a terrain that seemed to shift with every hour. The wind stole his sweat before it could cool him, and his mouth became a dry, aching cave. He rationed the water in his canteen, but the feeling of thirst was absolute, turning into a frantic physical ache. Then, the mirage began. First, it was subtle, a shimmer of deep blue on the horizon, the unmistakable sign of a vast, tranquil lake. It was exactly where Crazy Jack had pointed, and it was utterly convincing. He urged Athelred towards it, his heart pounding with the delusion of salvation. As he rode, the lake receded, resolving itself into the glaring white of the salt pan and the pale blue of the distant sky. The disappointment was a physical blow, stripping away his remaining composure. Then, the second stage of the desert's test began, the acoustic assault. Silas had always prided himself on his analytical separation of the singing sands from superstition. But now, dehydrated and utterly alone, the distinction evaporated. The wind was howling, yet beneath the chaotic shriek, the deep, mournful B-flat hum began its rhythmical pulse. This time, it wasn't a generalized geological sound, it was targeted. The low hum seemed to be pulling words out of the air, whispering fragments that sounded agonizingly like the forgotten voices of the 49ers. Water! No water! The gold is here, not silver! You missed the trail, Vance! Fool! Silas pressed his hands over his ears, desperate to shut out the sonic invasion. He tried to recite Schmidt's scientific explanation, quartz, friction, resonance, but the physics were weak and brittle against the sheer overwhelming conviction that the dead were talking to him. He saw things then, phantoms of men in tattered wool coats staggering across the blinding white salt, their arms outstretched toward the phantom lake. He saw the spectral outline of Elias Thorne's wagon, its wooden bones glowing faintly in the hallucinatory heat haze. He was no longer Silas Vance, the calculated mine owner. He was merely another doomed soul, trapped in the loop of the valley's tragic history. "It's not real!" he shouted, his voice cracking, the sound instantly swallowed by the immense dry stillness. He collapsed beneath a scraggly mesquite tree, Athelred standing over him, patiently waiting for the madness to pass. The burro, attuned to the land, seemed indifferent to the sonic assault. As the sun began its brutal descent, turning the mountains into molten shadow, the hum reached its terrifying zenith. The sound seemed to coalesce into a single, profound voice that echoed Wia's warning, "The land is mourning, and it is thirsty." In his delirium, Silas reached a terrifying conclusion, the ultimate test of his sanity. He had to silence the mourning. The voices, the mirage, the thirst, it all stemmed from the sand.
If he could find the great dune field, the source of the most intense sound, and destroy it, he could reclaim his logic, his claim, and his life. He stumbled onward, discarding his surveyor's tools in a fit of irrational fury, carrying only his canteen, now nearly empty, and his geological hammer. His motive had devolved from calculated wealth to a desperate primal war against the sound. He finally reached the edge of the vast, shifting dune field, the crying giants of Crazy Jack's prophecy. The sound was so intense here that the air felt solid, vibrating with a deep, resonant tone. Silas raised his hammer, intending to climb the slope and somehow smash the source of the noise, a futile, maniacal gesture against billions of tons of sand. But before he could take a single step onto the unstable slope, a familiar, harsh sound broke through the hum, the sharp, clear crack of a whip, followed by a curse he knew well. "Vance, you damn fool! Get off that sand!" It was Gus, Rigger, Riley, the mule driver who had tracked Silas's faint trail after discovering his abandoned supplies. Gus had no time for visions. He saw only a dehydrated man about to die in the soft sand. Gus pulled Silas onto his saddle and lashed Athelred's lead rope to his own rig. He forced a small, measured amount of water down Silas's throat, then started riding immediately, away from the terrifying acoustic basin. As they rode away, Silas looked back. The dunes, under the last light of the setting sun, hummed their colossal, steady B-flat of indifference. The mirage was gone, but the voice remained. Silas Vance was saved by the pragmatic world he had tried to escape, the common sense of a mule driver. He had failed the desert's test. He had pursued a ghost, become lost, and nearly surrendered his sanity to the overwhelming resonant voice of the land.
He returned to the Pharos Lode, shaken and subdued, no longer simply a man fighting the heat and distance, but a man fighting a memory, the knowledge that the difference between the calculating industrialist and the madman was merely a few hours without water and the volume of the morning sound. He had heard the forgotten voices, and now he knew exactly what the valley would do to his men if their guard ever dropped. The mining operation was now a battle fought on two fronts, the physical haul of silver and the psychological defense against the whispering sands. Silas Vance returned from the mirage of the lost mine, a changed man. He was still the pragmatic owner of the Pharos Lode, but the desert had stripped him bare, exposing the raw, fragile core of his ambition. He was no longer immune to the superstitions of his men. He had heard the forgotten voices. The psychological stability of the operation rested entirely on one man, Herr Schmidt, the engineer, armed with his transit and his unwavering faith in quantifiable reality, was the only one capable of offering an antidote to the collective dread that was poisoning the crew. Silas called Schmidt to his tent immediately. The air was heavy with humidity, a temporary oppressive condition signaling an unusual weather pattern, and the low, mournful hum of the distant dunes was strangely muted, almost silent. "Schmidt," Silas began, his voice raspy, still recovering from the dehydration. "Tell me again, precisely, what causes the sound. I need to believe it is only physics, not the crying giants, not the echo of the dead, just sound." Schmidt, sensing the shift in his employer, unfolded a detailed schematic of his racetrack playa findings. He was now not just an engineer, he was an advocate for sanity. "It is physics, Mr. Vance," he confirmed, tapping a precise set of calculations. "The phenomenon is called booming sand or singing sand. It has been documented in other deserts, though never on this scale. It is a perfect convergence of environmental factors, a natural acoustic mechanism." He laid out his argument with the precision of a drill bit hitting a vein. Number 1, grain size and shape.
The sand grains in the active dunes are almost perfectly spherical and uniform in size, between 0.2 and 0.5 millimeters. This perfect shape minimizes friction. Number 2. Zero humidity. The extreme aridity, the valley's furnace-like climate, is essential. The grains must be utterly dry to move against each other without static clinging. Number 3. The slip face. The sound is only created when massive quantities of the top layer of sand cascade down the steepest part of the dune, the slip face. Triggered by wind or slippage, the movement creates a layer of air trapped between the rapidly moving sheets of sand. Number 4. Resonance. This trapped air vibrates at a very specific low frequency, around 80 Hz, which corresponds to the deep B-flat note the men heard. The vast concave shape of the valley floor acts as a massive natural amplifier, turning the dunes into a geological loudspeaker. "The voices you heard, Silas," Schmidt said, using Silas's first name for the first time, "were the wind, the heat, and the sound of your own heart pounding in fear, interpreted by a mind in crisis. The morning is just a colossal, perfect friction rub." Silas stared at the schematics, searching for the comfort of the rational. Uniform grain size, 80 Hz resonance. It sounded cold, factual, and safe. But then he remembered Weah's words. The land takes care of its own. It does not like being dug. He remembered the madman of Leadfield, whose logic had been the first thing to shatter. "And the voices, Schmidt," Silas challenged, his eyes fixing on the engineer. "The words I heard, the warnings, did the wind speak English?" Schmidt hesitated. He could offer the scientific answer, but he knew it was insufficient. He knew that the morning was not just a sound, but an emotional trigger that targeted human weakness. "No, the wind did not speak English," Schmidt conceded, his voice softening. "But consider this, Silas. The Shoshone name it the morning because they know that when the conditions for that sound are perfect, utter dryness, immense heat, violent movement, those are also the conditions for death. The sound is not the spirit of death, it is the symptom of the conditions of death." He continued, laying out the crucial meeting point between science and superstition. "We as people listen to the sound as a warning. When the sound is loudest, the land is driest, the land is at its most aggressive. To a rational man, it means, check your water barrels. To a man in isolation, it means, the dead are calling. The outcome is the same. Survival depends on heeding the signal. Your mistake was trying to fight the signal, not to understand the conditions it signaled." Silas finally accepted the truth that the sound was the valley's most sophisticated defense mechanism. It was a physical phenomenon that operated perfectly as a psychological weapon. He made a sudden, critical decision. We stop trying to ignore the sound, we use it. He instructed Schmidt to integrate the morning into the operation's safety protocol. Schmidt was to build a rudimentary acoustic sensor, a vibrating diaphragm connected to a simple gauge near the main haul road. When the sound reaches a certain decibel level, a certain intensity of the morning, the teamsters stop, they rest, check their animals, and reinforce their water supply. We will treat the sound not as a ghost, but as a measurable environmental danger, like a sudden drop in temperature or a sandstorm. This was the crucial turning point. Silas Nance, the pragmatic capitalist, chose to incorporate the superstitions of the locals into the rationale of his science. He wasn't conquering the morning, he was learning to dance with it. The crew, hearing that the bosses were taking the crying giants seriously enough to build a ghost gauge, as they immediately dubbed Schmidt's sensor, felt a profound, if temporary, sense of relief. The valley was still terrifying, but now its voice was no longer a sign of impending doom. It was a clock and a warning bell. They were learning to live on the knife edge of survival, guided by a sound that was at once the product of pure physics and the enduring echo of every life that had failed to respect the desert's terrible truth. The whispers in the grains had ceased to be a curse and had become, by necessity, a strange, profound oracle. The decades had passed like the silent, relentless turning of the racetrack stones. The silver from the Pharos lode had peaked, plateaued, and finally dwindled. Silas Vance and Eleanor Reese had made their fortune, built their legacy, and, like the Diadochi before them, carved their niche into the arid empire of the Mojave. By the 1920s, the great ore wagons had ceased their heavy clanking, replaced by the whine of internal combustion engines and the roar of a new kind of visitor.
Nothing symbolized this absurd transition better than Scotty's castle. Located deep in the remote Grapevine Mountains, miles north of the old Pharos claim, the structure was a masterpiece of architectural delusion. A sprawling Spanish-style villa built by the wealthy Chicago insurance magnate Albert Mussey Johnson, who was charmed, and possibly swindled, by the charismatic self-proclaimed desert prospector Walter E. Scotty Scott. Silas Vance, now a wealthy, aging man with a perpetual tremor in his hands, a souvenir from his near-death experience in the desert, drove a heavy, imported automobile toward the castle in 1928. He was there as a guest of Johnson, but he felt like an anthropologist visiting a strange new tribe. The castle was a gaudy monument to misplaced capital. It boasted a hydroelectric plant, a massive pipe organ, imported Spanish tile, and even a supposed secret escape tunnel. It was a place designed to defy the desert with comfort, not courage. It had none of the grit of the Furnace Creek Depot, none of the brutal honesty of the Pharos Lode mine shaft. Silas stepped out of the car, the cool, high-altitude air a shock after the valley floor. He missed the heat. It was honest. He missed the struggle. It was meaningful. Inside the castle's sprawling courtyard, he found the famous Scotty, a wiry man in fringed buckskins who spent his days regaling tourists with wildly embellished tales of gold strikes that never existed and shootouts that never happened. Scotty was the desert's first great showman, selling the idea of the Wild West, not the brutal reality Silas had lived. "Mr. Vance, the Silver King," Scotty boomed, clapping Silas on the back with surprising strength. "Come see what real wealth looks like, not those grim little holes you dug." Scotty led Silas to the music room, dominated by the huge pipe organ. The absurdity was complete. Music designed for cathedrals played in a glorified desert lair financed by a man who had been told he was funding a gold mine. Silas smiled thinly. "It's magnificent, Scotty. But what about the sound, the morning? I haven't heard the dunes sing up here." Scotty shrugged, utterly unconcerned. "Ah, the whispering sands. Just the wind, Mr. Vance. Tourists love a good ghost story, though. Keeps 'em coming back." He paused, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Truth is, we don't hear much up here. Too many walls, too much music, too much stuff." Scotty's final statement was the key. The castle, with its thick walls, its concrete foundations, and its constant electric hum, was fundamentally designed to achieve the silence. It actively screened out the raw, terrifying voice of the valley that had defined the existence of the 49ers and nearly broken Silas. The contrast between the two eras was stark. The 1870s, the Vance era. The motive? Survival, extraction, legacy. Antagonist? Dehydration, isolation, the hum. Sound? The morning, a warning or oracle. The result? Bleached bones and silver veins. The 1920s, the Scotty era. The motive? Leisure, spectacle, consumption. Antagonist? Boredom, prohibition, lack of funds. Sound? Pipe organs, radios, tourist chatter. The result? Folly, extravagance, the silence. Later that evening, Silas found a quiet spot on the high balcony overlooking the vast valley floor. The full moon illuminated the dark ribbon of the haul road his teams had once labored on. He could no longer hear the hum of the dunes. The thick walls of the castle had successfully achieved the luxurious silence that shut out the desert's truth. But in that absence of sound, Silas realized the great danger of the new era. The settlers of the 49er era died because they were too foolish to listen. The miners of the 1870s survived because they were eventually forced to listen to the morning as a warning. But these new visitors, the tourists, and the millionaires like Johnson, were building walls to actively prevent listening. They had conquered the physical desert, but in doing so, they had deafened themselves to its wisdom. The real tragedy was not the lost gold or the ruined lives. It was the forgetting. The desert's voice, the profound warning of the singing sand, was now reduced to a quaint, marketable ghost story for the entertainment of the wealthy. Silas leaned on the railing, feeling the cold marble beneath his fingers. He had come to the valley to escape the uncertainties of the external world, seeking the certainty of silver. He had left with the understanding that the only certainty the desert offered was its relentless, unbending truth, a truth that spoke through the sand. He was now part of the past, a relic of a brutal, honest struggle. He knew that the fire that never sleeps, the fire of ambition, destruction, and forgetting, was now burning under the guise of luxury and tourism, its destructive nature hidden behind the thick, silent walls of Scotty's castle. The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic gold strike or a mine collapse, but with a piece of meticulously penned stationery. The year was 1888. After a decade of grueling operation, the Pharos lode was still producing silver, but the veins were becoming erratic, and the constant psychological battle against the morning continued to plague the workers. Eleanor Reese, tired of hearing about crying giants and whispering sands, finally commissioned an independent academic study of the phenomenon. She needed to know the cost of the valley's superstition. The official report arrived in a leather-bound folder, written by Dr. Alistair Finch, a fastidious geologist from the East Coast. He had spent 6 weeks camped near the main dune field, enduring the heat and the sound that had broken Crazy Jack Pendleton. Silas Vance and Herr Schmidt stood in the dusty depot at Furnace Creek, reading the report by the light of a flickering kerosene lamp. The title page read, "Acoustic Properties of the Aeolian Deposits, Death Valley, CA." Dr. Finch's conclusions were precise, clinical, and undeniable. The cause. The phenomenon, colloquially known as singing or booming sand, is the consequence of the geophone effect, triggered by large-scale avalanching of dry sand on the steep slip face of the dunes. The mechanism. When a critical mass of dry sand is disturbed by wind or heat stress, the layers shear. The sudden high velocity of the sand movement traps a layer of air between the sliding sheets. This layer oscillates at a low frequency, the 80 to 100 Hz range, which is amplified by the convex shape of the dune and the parabolic geography of the valley. The final truth. The morning is not a sound of wind or echoes of the dead, but the acoustic signature of billions of quartz grains vibrating in unison. It is a natural resonator, a spectacular manifestation of extreme geological dryness and friction. The phenomenon is entirely rational and predictable. Schmidt threw his hat on the desk in triumph. "There it is, Silas, the proof. No ghosts, no curses, just physics. We told the men it was true, and now the university confirms it." The report was scientifically a complete victory for rationality. It confirmed everything Schmidt had hypothesized after his rat-trake play encounter. The mystery was solved. The singing sand was merely a colossal natural phenomenon, the sound of sand avalanching.
Silas, however, did not share Schmidt's elation. He slowly closed the report, the leather cover feeling heavy and final in his hands. He looked up, not at the triumphant engineer, but out the grimy window toward the dark, silent mass of the Funeral Mountains. "It's a beautiful explanation, Schmidt," Silas said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's clean, it's final. It's also meaningless to the men who died here." He walked away from the report, away from the comfort of the scientific conclusion, and began his prospector's confession. "I heard the voices, Schmidt. I told you I didn't, but I did.
When I was out there, nearly dead, dehydrated, I heard them. They were not rational. They did not speak in hertz or friction coefficients. They spoke of thirst and betrayal. Silas walked over to the corner, where he kept his worn, leather-bound journal, the book where he kept not only his financial records, but also the emotional debris of his years in the valley. Dr. Finch says the sound is sand avalanching, Silas said, turning a weathered page in his journal. I say the sound is the land telling you to confess your sin. Silas then recounted the depth of his crisis during the mirage of the lost mine, the moment he had broken his own cardinal rule, abandoning his survey logic to chase a mythical gold strike born of Crazy Jack's madness. I nearly died because greed led me to foolishness, just like the 49ers, Silas admitted, his confession raw and difficult. I heard the voices because my guilt was amplified by the valley's hum. The sound didn't create the madness, it found the madness already in me, the same greed that killed Jack Pendleton. He looked at Schmidt, the man of science, the man who had pulled him back from the brink of delusion. The scientific truth is that the sound is sand avalanching. The emotional truth is that the sound is the only constant thing in this valley, the only voice that has seen every single man fail or survive. It is the perfect mechanical reminder that we are small, fleeting, and utterly dependent on the land's mercy. He had come to understand that the superstition held more functional truth than the science. The Shoshone called it the morning because the sound coincided with conditions that demanded reverence and withdrawal. The scientific explanation only gave the men license to ignore the warning, believing a calculated risk could overcome a natural law. Silas took the official report, carefully folding it and placing it not in the office vault, but in the depot's common room next to the water barrels. We will tell the men the science, Silas instructed Schmidt. We will tell them it is avalanching sand, nothing more. But we will also tell them this. When the morning reaches its peak, you stop, you find shelter, you respect the sound as the symptom of a killing environment. The mystery of the singing sand had reached its climax. The scientific truth, sand avalanching, was revealed, offering a rational escape. But that rationality was immediately undercut by the personal truth of survival, respect for the land. Silas understood that the purpose of the sound was not to entertain physicists, but to protect those who listened. The Pharos lode survived its remaining years not because its men stopped believing in the whispers, but because they learned to quantify their fear. The ghost gauge remained, a physical testament to the marriage of superstition and science, a device that measured the intensity of the sand's mournful voice, protecting the bodies and minds of the men until the silver finally ran dry. The legacy of the Pharos lode was not just the silver extracted, but the wisdom gained, the voice of the valley, whether caused by physics or spirits, was the only reliable oracle in that desolate land. The decade of the 1890s brought the inevitable end. The rich veins of silver in the Pharos lode grew thin. The ore grade dropped, and the high cost of hauling, never fully conquered, finally exceeded the market price of the metal. Eleanor Reese, with a shrewd eye on the balance sheet, ordered the operation to be wound down. Silas Vance, the ambitious prospector who had challenged the Funeral Mountains, was tasked with the final symbolic act, the journey out. He wasn't leaving with a fortune, for that had been banked years ago. He was leaving with a profound, costly education in humility and survival. The final physical challenge lay not in the mountains they had tunneled through, but on the valley floor itself, in a desolate, unique section of the salt pan known locally as the Devil's Cornfield. The Devil's Cornfield was a wide expanse where the salt flats mixed with massive clumps of arrowweed, a desert shrub that often grew in dense, isolated mounds. The heat, moisture, and salt
had interacted to form crystalline deposits around the roots of these shrubs, creating jagged, sharp spires of crystallized earth and salt that jutted out of the ground like grotesque, pale stalks of corn. This area, situated near the exit of the old hall route, had to be crossed for the final wagon carrying the remaining equipment and personal effects. It was a chaotic, dangerous maze, a fitting final obstacle for men leaving a chaotic land. Silas chose to lead this last journey himself, only accompanied by Gus Riley and Herr Schmidt. Gus drove the final mule team, Schmidt rode with his beloved surveying equipment, and Silas, mounted on Aethelred, rode point. The first miles were torture. The mules, sensing freedom, moved too quickly, catching their hooves on the salt spires. The iron-rimmed tires of the wagon screeched and groaned as they bounced and scraped over the brittle, ankle-breaking terrain. Every jarring collision was a reminder of the uncompromising hostility of the land. "The devil himself planted this crop," Gus grumbled, wrestling the heavy reins as the mules struggled against the abrasive salt. The spires, sharp as flint, tore at the mules' legs and scarred the tough leather of the harnesses. Silas dismounted, walking ahead, looking for the softest route, a path that was neither too brittle with salt nor too soft with the quicksand-like silt beneath. As they moved, the temperature, amplified by the reflection off the blinding salt crystals, soared. The sun hammered down, the silence broken only by the rasping breath of the animals and the continuous grating sound of salt being crushed beneath the wheels. Silas stopped near a particularly large cluster of spires. He was sweating profusely. The water in his canteen now lukewarm. He felt the familiar pull of dehydration, and with it, the threat of the morning. He waited. He listened. The air was clear, save for the crackling heat. "Do you hear it, Schmidt?" Silas asked, not looking at the engineer. "The hum? Is the gauge reading high?" Schmidt, who had spent the last 5 years constantly monitoring the acoustic sensor that Silas had commissioned, pulled out his worn, personalized pocket gauge. "No, Silas, it is minimal. The atmosphere is too humid today. The sand grains cling. There is no perfect dry friction. The morning is silent." The silence was paradoxically more unnerving than the sound. The absence of the great resonating B-flat meant the immediate psychological threat was gone, but the physical danger remained absolute. The land was not shouting its warning, it was waiting in ambush. Silas looked down at the crystalline spires of the Devil's cornfield. They were beautiful, destructive, and entirely rational. They were the result of simple geology, evaporation, and time. No ghosts, no curses, just the inevitable consequence of water and salt mixing in a hyper-arid basin. This was the final, hard-won understanding of the land, that the valley did not need spirits to be lethal. Its true power lay in its mundane, relentless geological reality. The singing sands were terrifying, but at least they were a warning. The sharp, silent spires of the cornfield were pure, indifferent danger. He finally spoke, summarizing the decade of struggle for his companions. "We came here, Gus, because we believed a piece of metal, silver, could grant us control over our lives. We thought our sweat and our money could conquer the land. We brought maps and steam engines and logic." He kicked at a spire, watching the salt crystals shatter like fragile glass. "But the land taught us that our logic was irrelevant. It showed us the madman of Leadfield, the failure of isolation. It showed me the mirage, the failure of greed, and it spoke to us through the dunes, telling us the simple truth: respect the conditions or die." He turned to Schmidt, the engineer. "The science was only useful when we married it to the Shoshone's superstition. We survived, Schmidt, because we learned to treat the rational sound of avalanching sand as the emotional warning of the crying giants." Gus Riley nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the mules. "We learned to listen, Mr. Vance. That's all the desert asks. They pressed on, moving slowly, painstakingly through the cornfield. It took them 6 hours to traverse the few miles, the setting sun painting the sky in a final fiery spectacle that did not, for once, feel malevolent. As they exited the Devil's Cornfield and reached the familiar, slightly rising ground that led out of the valley basin, Silas stopped. He looked back at the vast, desolate expanse, the funeral mountains, the salt pan, the dark shape of the dune field. They were all visible, fading into the violet twilight. He took his hand from Aethelred's neck, a movement symbolizing the end of the journey. He was leaving the physical wealth, the emotional toll, and the knowledge he had fought so hard to gain. The final lesson was simple, embodied by the silent, indifferent spires of the cornfield. Death Valley does not care about human ambition. It only cares about its own physics. Those who live and work within its bounds must shed their pride, listen to its voice, and abide by its brutal rules. Silas turned his burro westward, toward the soft, rolling hills that led to civilization. He left the valley not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a humbled student, carrying the only true treasure the land had given him, the hard-won understanding that the path to life often lay in listening to the voices of the dead, whether they were the scientifically resonant hum of the sand or the whispered warnings of his own fear. The mining era of the Whispering Sands was over, leaving behind only bones, abandoned shafts, and the knowledge that the fire that never sleeps was less about a single catastrophic event and more about the slow, silent process of forgetting the desert's relentless truth. Silas Vance rode slowly, the sun a vast sinking orb of molten copper behind the towering serrated peaks of the Panamint Range. They were on the upward slope, steadily gaining altitude, putting the deepest basin of Death Valley behind them. The wagon, driven by Gus Riley, lumbered on ahead, the sound of its wheels muffled by the softer, rising soil. Herr Schmidt rode alongside, already planning the comfortable life he would build with his share of the silver. Silas, however, felt no joy of escape. He felt a profound sense of closure, the deep, quiet exhaustion of a war not won, but concluded on terms dictated by the enemy. He knew the money was waiting, the mortgage paid, the security secured, but the greatest treasure he carried was the understanding of the land's truth. He pulled Aethelred to a stop on a high ridge. Below him, the vast expanse of the valley floor stretched out, a canvas of purple and gold in the twilight. He could see the dark, distant mass of the funeral mountains, the faint white scar of the salt pan, and most prominently, the soft, shifting contours of the singing dunes. He dismounted, walking to the edge of the ridge. The air here was cooler, cleaner, carrying the faint, earthy scent of creosote bush. He waited, listening, not with the frantic desperation of the man who had suffered the mirage, but with the patient reverence of a student awaiting a final lecture. And then it came. The wind was a gentle sigh, but it was enough. The subtle low hum began, a sustained, deep B-flat traveling across the immense space with the purity of a perfectly tuned bell. It was softer than he had ever heard it, filtered by the distance, yet it was unmistakable. Silas stood, letting the sound wash over him. He no longer heard the frantic, fragmented whispers of the 49ers. He no longer felt the scientific pressure to categorize it as 80 hertz friction. He heard the lament.
It was the accumulated sorrow of the valley, the passive, constant expression of its indifference to the brief, violent dramas of human ambition. The sound was not a threat, it was a tribute. It was the ghost of the dunes, a vast, resonant echo for every soul who had failed to listen. Silas thought of them. Elias Thorne and the lost 49ers, their desperate, foolish gamble for a shortcut, paid for in lives and named in despair. The hum was their funeral dirge, played by the very sand that covered their final resting places. Crazy Jack Pendleton, the man who heard the hum and let it drive him into paranoia, mistaking the land's indifference for personal betrayal. The sound was the echo of his final, isolated delusion. The mules and the men, the countless animals whose bones lay scattered along the haul road, and the workers, like Patty, whose sanity had frayed under the oppressive heat and the relentless, unseen psychological pressure. The sound was the collective groan of their exhaustion. The scientific conclusion that the sound was sand avalanching was the head's understanding. But standing there, bathed in the red light of the dying sun, Silas finally grasped the heart's understanding. The sound was the valley's memory. "They're not calling us back, Gus," Silas murmured, as Gus walked up to join him. "They're just singing the history." Gus, who had seen enough death and madness in the desert to last 3 lifetimes, nodded. "Maybe so, Mr. Vance. It's a mournful sound, all right, but it's reliable. You can count on it being here long after this silver's spent." Gus's simple, pragmatic wisdom confirmed Silas's final emotional resolution. The true failure of the Pharaoh Slode would have been to leave the valley without understanding the meaning of that sound. Silas realized that the fire that never sleeps was not the fire of a library burning, nor the fire of the sun, but the relentless internal fire of human ambition and forgetting. The Alexandria Library was lost in a blaze of history and argument. Death Valley's history was preserved, perfectly recorded in the acoustic phenomenon of its sands. He had learned to listen to the whisper of the 80 Hz vibration as a warning of thirst, a testament to the fact that the land cared only for physics. But he had also learned to listen to it as a lament for the lost, a spiritual truth that the human cost of the silver was recorded permanently in the air. He looked down one last time at the dunes, now soft and dark against the twilight. The low hum continued, a gentle, sustained chord that carried no malice, only the vast, deep indifference of geologic time. Silas put his foot back into the stirrup, ready to leave. He was carrying no physical sample of the singing sand. He no longer needed one. He carried the sound itself, permanently etched into his memory, a perpetual reminder that the ghost of the dunes was not a supernatural entity, but a perfect resonant warning against the folly of forgetting the limits of human enterprise. He left the valley, a survivor, carrying a wisdom that no gold or silver could buy, a man who had finally made peace with the whispering sands. The story of the Pharaoh Slode ended not with a bang of industry, but with the soft, eternal hum of the sand, singing its ancient, beautiful, and terrifying song. The eternal unchanging, a national monument is declared. The final act of the story belongs not to the miners, but to the land itself. The silver rush faded. The borax industry dwindled. The decadence of Scotty's castle became a tourist attraction, and the castle itself eventually burned in a fire, a symbolic gesture completing the cycle of the valley's history of ruin. The great human drama of the 19th century was over. Yet the land remained, utterly indifferent to the ambition and the folly that had defined 2 generations of invaders. In 1933, President Herbert Hoover signed a proclamation establishing Death Valley as a national monument. The act was the final official recognition that the land's value was not in its minerals, but in its magnificence and its mystery. Silas Vance, long retired and living a quiet life of comfort earned by his hard-won wisdom, read the news in a San Francisco paper. He smiled, understanding the profound irony. The land that had once been named a curse was now named a treasure, a place preserved not for its wealth, but for its terrifying, unique beauty. The roads he and Gus Riley had labored to carve out for the 20-mule teams were paved, becoming scenic drives for tourists whose cars carried air conditioning and endless supply of bottled water. The great empty canyons that had terrified the 49ers now were photographed by millions. But the essence of the valley remained unchanged. The vast flat expanse of the salt pan, the funeral mountains, and the Devil's Golf Course, they all stood precisely as they had. And the sand, the crying giants, continued to sing. Tourists visiting the park still asked rangers about the sound. They heard the faint, unsettling boom and asked for the ghost story. The rangers, armed with the scientific reports commissioned by men like Eleanor Reese and Herr Schmidt, explained the sand avalanching, the 80 Hz resonance, and the spherical quartz grains. They offered the rational truth. But those who had lived, suffered, and survived in the valley, the descendants of the Timbisha Shoshan, the few remaining prospectors, and the memory of Silas Vance, knew the deeper emotional truth. The whispering sands of Death Valley were the ultimate historians. They sang not of science, but of the relentless price of human ambition. The sound was the land's ultimate expression of its eternal unchanging, a perpetual reminder that the true struggle of the American West was not the conquering of the frontier, but the humbling acceptance of its limits. The ghost of the dunes at sunset was not a phantom. It was a profound geological oracle, forever singing the lament for the lost, ensuring that the fire of human folly, though briefly extinguished, could never truly be forgotten. The eternal unchanging, a national monument, is declared. The 1890s surrendered to the new century with a muted clang, not a glorious fanfare. The silver rush, the borax bonanza, and the desperate, brutal commerce that had scarred Death Valley faded into memory. The massive 20-mule teams were gone, their colossal wagons left to rot in the dry washes, their iron wheels sinking into the silt. The Pharaoh's Lode, like all its rivals, was an abandoned network of collapsed shafts, rust-streaked tailings, and silent machinery. Silas Vance and Eleanor Rice had long since withdrawn their capital, retiring to cities where the air was moist and the ground was stable. They carried their fortunes, built upon the hard-won lesson of respect, but they left behind the true, ongoing wealth of the valley, its utter, uncompromising indifference. The valley had endured. It had survived the folly of the lost 49ers, the relentless industry of the borax kings, and the calculated greed of the silver miners. Now, in the 1920s, it faced its final invasion, the tourist. The new roads, built on the flattened tracks of the old haul routes, brought not prospectors seeking wealth, but families seeking wonder. The struggle for survival was replaced by the search for spectacle. The valley became a curiosity, a place where one could marvel at the extreme heat, shudder at the Devil's Golf Course, and listen to the ghost stories of the singing dunes, all from the comfort of a Ford automobile. The ultimate symbol of this shift was Scotty's Castle, a testament to money and eccentricity that actively sought to shield its occupants from the reality of the environment. The castle's walls, its thick plaster, and its modern plumbing achieved the silence that insulated its wealthy inhabitants from the valley's genuine voice, transforming the deep, terrifying wisdom of the morning into a marketable legend. The preservationists' gaze. By the early 1930s, the national mood had shifted from extraction to preservation. Influential figures, often drawn to the stark, unique beauty of the American desert, began to advocate for the permanent protection of the valley. This movement was spearheaded by the very elements the miners had struggled against: geology and uniqueness. Death Valley was recognized as a geological marvel, a gigantic graben, a down-dropped block of the Earth's crust, holding the lowest point in North America. Its strange phenomena, the moving rocks of the racetrack playa, the vast salt flats, and the towering dunes were deemed priceless scientific resources worthy of conservation. On February 11, 1933, President Herbert Hoover signed a proclamation establishing Death Valley National Monument. The proclamation was the final, formal act that stripped the valley of its economic identity and affirmed its ecological and historical one. The land was no longer defined by the gold it refused to yield, but by the magnificent, terrible truth it embodied. Silas Vance, a comfortable septuagenarian living out his final years in the moist climate of coastal California, received the news in a letter from Herr Schmidt, who was now a respected engineering professor. Schmidt enclosed a newspaper clipping of the proclamation. "You see, Silas," Schmidt wrote, his meticulous hand still steady, "the government has affirmed my final report. The valley's value is in its rational physics, not in its silver. It is preserved because it is the world's most perfect natural laboratory." But Silas saw the deeper, more profound truth, the truth that spanned from the fateful shortcut of the 49ers to the tourist's snapshot. The morning of the Singing Sands was still there. Its 80 hertz resonance did not stop simply because a piece of paper in Washington, D.C. declared the area a monument. The Devil's Cornfield still lay sharp and unforgiving, a constant reminder of the difficulty of movement. The graves of the forgotten voices, the 49ers, the desperate prospectors, the men who succumbed to the heat, remained undisturbed, their sacrifice now contributing to a national narrative, not just a private tragedy. The ultimate theme of the story was the valley's survival. The valley's indifference. The monument designation was a gesture made by man. The valley's eternal unchanging was a law of nature. The desert did not celebrate its preservation. It did not care about the new boundaries, the new park rangers, or the tourists who crowded the scenic overlooks. The temperature remained the highest ever recorded on Earth. The sand continued to slide. The water remained scarce. The valley's history, the struggles, the deaths, the fortunes, and the folly was merely a brief human drama that had unfolded across its surface. The land had effortlessly absorbed the ambitions of men, rendering their most complex efforts, from the 20-mule teams to the hydro-powered systems of Scottish Castle, as temporary and fleeting as the morning mirage. The ultimate and enduring lesson learned by Silas Vance, the lesson that now became the valley's collective wisdom, was this: the land's greatest power was its indifference. It was immune to human hope, ambition, and greed. It survived not through fire or flood, but through relentless, predictable adherence to its own severe laws. The ghost of the dunes, the magnificent, mournful sound continued its eternal work. It was no longer a personal threat to a struggling prospector, but a profound, resonant oracle for the entire nation. It warned all who visited that while they could look at the majesty of the national monument, they must never forget the humility required for survival. The whispering sands of Death Valley were the ultimate testament to the truth that the most powerful force in the American West was not the conquering will of man, but the relentless, beautiful, and utterly uncompromising, eternal unchanging of the wild earth itself.